Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel, and as always, welcome to a brand new crash course. In this crash course, we're going to cover everything that you need to know about Vuex, and specifically, we're going to be working with Vuex 4, which is the Vuex version needed if you are going to create a Vue 3 application. If you are creating a Vue 2 application, then you would use Vuex 3. Now, because this is the latest version, I'm assuming in the future that's what most people are going to be using, and that's why we're going to specifically work with Vuex 4. So I'll talk a little bit about what Vuex is in the next video, but right now you can just kind of think of it as a state management system. So I'll talk about that again in the next video, but let me quickly discuss what the project that we're going to build is. So this is the project that we are going to build essentially with Vuex. So this is actually going to be very Vuex heavy, and it's going to contain almost every single concept that we need to know about Vuex. So it seems like a relatively simple application. It seems like a little counter over here. It's not a really big deal, but it actually deals with almost all facets of Vuex. So over here, very simple counter. So you can actually, let me actually zoom in a little bit. So over here we have a very simple counter. You can actually increase the number. So maybe you want to increase the number by 5. Well, we can see here now we're at 265. We can also decrease the number. We can also add or subtract by a random number. And what this is doing is it's actually fetching a random number from an external API. So the reason why I'm doing this is because we want to be able to use Vuex with asynchronous kind of requests. So this is how I'm going to show you guys how we can do that. So this is how we're going to be dealing with Vuex through asynchronous requests. And also over here we have basically history. And this is again another cool feature that we can do with Vuex. And basically, like it simulates all of the history of all the counters that we have. So if I were to add this by 1, you can see here that now this is 1200, and you can see here that this is appended also. And over here we can basically search for a specific number. So we can search for 6. Over here we don't see any number with 6, but let's say we want to search for 249. And we can actually search for that, and we can actually see all of the 249s. And this is again going to be done through a really cool Vuex feature known as getters. So that is basically the project. And again, it seems like a relatively simple project, but I believe it covers pretty much everything that we need to really know about Vuex. So it's a really kind of good beginner project. And lastly, if you we're going to be building this project from scratch, so there's nothing really that you have to clone. But if you want to take a look at the repo and the code, it's all over here. Right now it's a private repo, but you can go ahead to my GitHub link, and when this video is published, it will be public. So just go to my GitHub repo and then Vuex 4 crash course, and you should see all of the code. So that is pretty much it. So that's basically what we're covering in the crash course. Now in the next video, let's actually start discussing what in the world is Vuex. Okay, so let's answer the question, what is Vuex? Now Vuex is a library that helps us manage state in our Vue application. Now what do I mean about state? State essentially is pieces of data that reside within our Vue app. For instance, if you scroll down over here, there's a quick little example. Over here, we have a simple Vue component, and then in the data method, we have a count variable right over here. And this right here is a piece of state. Now this state is located in our component. So essentially it is only accessible by this component. Now if we wanted this state to be accessible by other components, in this case we would have to pass it down as props. Now that can be a little bit problematic, and let me kind of show you why. Let's look at a quick diagram. So over here, I have basically a Vue app, and I have basically the component tree. So over here, we have our root component, and it has basically 3 child components, and each of these childs have children of their own. So you can see here this has two children components, and this over here has a child component of itself, and then this one has another child component. So you can see here that it is a relatively large application. Now let's say that this component houses a piece of state over here, hot dog. So this component houses this piece of state, and let's say that, well, this component over here needs that information. So this component needs that information. And let's also say that, well, this component right here also needs that information. So somehow, some way, we basically have to pass this state over here to these components. So there's a little bit of a problem with getting this piece of information to these two components. And let's actually discuss them in detail right now. So if I want to get this state to this component, well, what I would have to do is I would have to pass it down. So I would go ahead and basically pass it down as a prop to this component over here, even though it doesn't even need it. And then this component would pass it down as a prop over here. So this is kind of a tedious task, especially if we have multiple components. Maybe if we had 7 and we had to pass it all the way down, we would have to go ahead and pass it down each particular component, even though it might not even be using it, to get it to the correct component that actually needs it. This is actually known as prop drilling, and this is kind of a problem that Vuex solves. So again, this is kind of a problem that we are facing. Another problem is there is actually absolutely no way I can pass this piece of state to this component over here with this architecture. The reason for this is you can really only pass them down, or you can pass them up. So I guess you could pass it up and then pass it down, but you can never pass it sideways. You can never pass it in a lateral fashion because, well, these are siblings, and you can't pass props through a sibling manner because, well, there's really no connection between them, as you can see. So really we would have to do something very, very awkward, like passing the prop up and then passing the prop down and then pressing the prop back down. So it might even be better to actually have that state located somewhere over here at the very top and then go ahead and pass it down. But you can see that this really is kind of awkward. It's very awkward. Over here we have prop drilling. Over here there's no real way to kind of pass state in a sibling manner. So this really gets very, very awkward. And this is basically what Vuex is trying to solve. Essentially, Vuex solved these two problems, and let me show you how it does it. So basically, Vuex, what it does is, instead of having basically this piece of state that is needed by many components in our application, throughout our application, instead of having it housed in a particular component, we have it housed separately right over here. So we have it housed separately, kind of outside of the component tree. And essentially it's housed in this store, so this Vue store, and literally any component that needs it, wherever it is located, all it has to do is say, hey, I need the hot dog state. And so what ends up happening is, okay, no problem, I can give you that information. So I'm going to give you this information. Hey, I also need the hot dog state. No problem, I can give you that information very, very easily. And then this one over here is going to say the exact same thing. Hey, I need the hot dog state. And then over here, you can just get it very easily. So you can see here that all these components, they get all the state that they want without any pop drilling or kind of the inability to pass state from a sibling manner. And that's because this really important state that is needed by multiple components is actually housed in a centralized store. And this is basically known as a global state, whereas this state over here is known as a local state. So we want to use global states, and thus we want to use Vuex if basically we have a piece of information, a piece of state that is used heavily by multiple components, and they're kind of just passed down everywhere. So again, if we have a piece of state that is needed to be used by multiple components, that is when we use Vuex. And that is essentially what I am going to teach with this application over here. And so I hope that kind of summarizes what Vuex is. Now in the next section, we're actually going to go ahead and just start coding this application. So I'll see you guys then. Okay, so the first step that we have to do to actually create this Vue application is to, well, create a Vue app. So to do this, well, this is very, very easy. All we have to do is go to our terminal if we're on Mac, or our command prompt if we are on Windows machine. So I am going to go to the terminal. Over here, this is the terminal, and let me just quickly zoom in so everyone can see what is going on here. There we go. Okay, so here is our terminal. Now in here, we're going to do a little bit of commands just to create our Vue application. Now this is only going to work if you have Node installed. If you don't have Node installed, well, just go to the Node webpage and just install it. You'll get a quick little wizard. It's a very, very easy installation process. To check if you have Node installed, you can just simply do Node version, or you can do something like npm version, because if you install Node, it also comes with npm. If you get some sort of version over here, then you know you have Node installed. If you don't get a version, you get some sort of error, then we'll go ahead and install Node. Another thing that you need to install is the Vue CLI, and you're going to want to install this globally. Now to check if you have the Vue CLI installed, you can just simply do vue.version. Over here, similarly, I kind of get a bunch of output right over here. So I guess it's not Vue version, but if you do Vue on its own and you get some sort of output, that means you know you have the Vue CLI installed. If you do Vue and it gives you trigger some sort of error, then you don't have the Vue CLI installed. Go ahead and install it by doing npm install at Vue CLI, or at Vue/CLI, and you want to install this globally. So go ahead and install it globally. Now I am going to just quickly cut this because, well, I already installed the CLI and this might take a little bit of time. But this is basically what you would have to do to be able to essentially get the Vue commands. So let me just quickly cut this, and there we go. So once you install it, you should be able to do Vue and you get a bunch of this output right over here. So yeah, just go ahead and do install at Vue CLI, and you want to install it globally. Now the next step is to move into a directory where you want your Vue application to reside. Now in this case, this is going to be in my desktop. So let's go to desktop, and then in my desktop I have a specific directory for my YouTube videos. And then I'm gonna, I also have in YouTube my Vuex directory, and this is where essentially my Vuex application is going to reside. So over here, I'm going to do something very simple. I'm just going to do Vue create, and then I'm going to essentially create an application, and then I can basically say, you know, what I want to call this. So I can just say something like Vue with Vuex. I'm gonna call this tut because this is a tutorial. So I can go ahead and actually create this and give it a little bit of time. Let's see how long this takes. I would rather not pause the video, but over here you can see here that it's saying, hey, do you want to work with Vue 2, or do you want to work with Vue 3, or do you want any kind of manual configurations? In this case, we're just going to work with Vue 3 because, well, we're going to be working with Vuex 4, which is specific with Vue 3. So let's enter that. And then this is going to take a little bit of time to kind of configure. So I wouldn't, I'm not sure, let's see if I can stall enough because I would rather not pause the video, but I think I'm going to have to pause the video. So once you have this kind of set up and installed, in the next video, we're gonna actually just open up the project and kind of maneuver around the components. Okay, so now that it is installed, let's go ahead and run this application. So as you can see, if you get this little kind of information, you know you have installed it correctly. Over here, this is how we run our application. Now I actually tried to run it beforehand, and I actually completely forgot that I have to move into that directory. So let's move into the Vuex Vue with Vuex tutorial directory, or whatever it is that you called it. So Vue with Vuex tutorial. So I'll move into that directory, and then I'm going to run npm run serve. So let's go ahead and let's do npm run serve. And once we do this, you can see it is starting our development server. It should be a very, very quick build. And now you can see that our Vue application is running on localhost 880. So now let's actually go to localhost 880. I'm going to keep this version, even though the actual server for this application is actually closed. I'm going to keep this version just alive and well for now. I'm just going to open up another localhost 880, and we should see our new Vue application. And this is essentially what you should see as well. So let's go ahead and let's kind of configure it so it looks a little bit like this. So let's go ahead and let's go open up our Vue application. So open up your favorite code editor. I'm going to be using VS Code. And so once you go into VS Code, just open whatever directory. So this is going to be in my desktop. I actually have a better approach. So you can either open it up in your desktop, but what I could do actually is just kill the development server and just simply do code dot, and that just simply opens it up for me with that directory. Now I can go ahead and just start it again, and there we go. Now I'm running my app again. So let's actually put this in here, and there we go. So now we have our Vue app, and you can see here, this right here is the root component. This is the app.vue, and this is basically corresponding to everything that we see right over here. So let's actually do a little bit of, well, cleanup. Let's get rid of the hello world component. Let's also get rid of the import for the hello world. Let's get rid of this for now. And then we'll keep everything else the same. So we'll keep that Vue logo. And let's give this a quick save, and we should see a little bit of changes. So over here you can see that, hey, everything over here changed. All we have is the Vue component. So let's actually go about now and create the counter. So we're just going to work on this section for now. We'll work on this section a little bit later. But let's actually go ahead and let's create this counter. Now I want to kind of do this in a way where it really demonstrates the benefit of Vuex. So what we could do is we have a bunch of components over here. What we could do is we could just simply create a counter component and kind of just display that on the app. That is what we would typically do. But I want to kind of demonstrate the power of Vuex, and to do that, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to create 4 other components, and all these other they're just going to kind of be dummy components, and essentially they're just going to be a bunch of children components that essentially eventually house the counter component. If that doesn't make sense, let me kind of explain it to you right now. So over here I'm going to create, let me quickly just zoom in as well. So I am going to create a, let's say, component 1. So this is component1.vue. And essentially, let's create a typical template over here. So let's go ahead and copy this. Let's paste this in there. Let's get rid of this logo. And this is, get rid of the name as well. And let's also get rid of these styles. And essentially, that's it for this component. But this is going to be the child of the app component. So let's actually go ahead and let's import this. So let's import, oops, not in the export default, right over here. Let's import component1 from, we're going to import it from, well, ./components/component1. And so essentially we're going to render component1. So let's go ahead and let's render component1 right over here. So that's what we are going to do. And then also we have to, of course, define the components. So we have to say, here's the components, and, well, we have component 1, that is a component that is in our application. So if we go ahead and we look over here and we quickly do a refresh, seems like we still have some sort of an error. So let's see why that is. So it seems like we have module error. The template requires child elements. So let's see here. So it seems like this seems okay to me. Oh, of course we need, well, a div. So let's create this div right over here. I think that's what this is trying to talk about. So let's save that. And now if we go ahead, okay, now it works. So now let's actually go ahead and let's create another component. So we're going to create another component. We're going to call this component2. Component2.view. And this is going to contain exactly the same template, but this is basically going to be rendered by component1. So let's go ahead and let's do a similar import. So we're going to do import component2 from component2. We're going to have over here all of the components. We can also give this a name, but I'm not going to dwell on that. And over here, we can go ahead and render component2. Now you can render it either this way or you can render it this way as well. What I mean by that is you could do something like this. But I like it with capital because it just seems like a component. So there we go. So this is rendering component2. Now let's actually go ahead and create another one. So let's create component3.view. And let's also create component4.view. And then basically component3.view is a child of component2. So let's basically save. Let's actually go ahead and actually use this template. This might be a little bit easier. So let's copy that in there. Let's copy that in there. And essentially over here, we're just going to change this to 3 for component2, 3, 3, and then 3. And then for component3, essentially this is going to render component4. So 4, 4, and then 4. And over here also 4. Let's make sure I change that over here. And then for component 4, this is actually going to render our counter component. So over here we have our counter.view. So let's just paste that in there. This, we're just going to get rid of any kind of components that we imported because this is going to actually be our counter. So we're going to say here an h1 of, what do we call it over here? We called it Vuex counter. So we're going to say Vuex counter. So let's save that. And then over here, this is going to be, well, the counter. So let's change this to counter. And we're going to be taking this counter right over here. And then we have a counter. And over here we have a counter. So you might see what in the world is the point of this? And in reality, there really is no point of doing it this way. This is actually a very bad way of doing it. But the reason why I want to kind of demonstrate this is because, well, this is a very likely situation in our app. We could have right here our root component, and this is rendering a particular component right over here. So this is component 1. Now this component can be rendering another component, component 2. And then this component could be rendering component 3. And then this component could be rendering component 4. And then this component is rendering the counter. Now the issue might lie is, well, the app right over here might house all of the state regarding to the counter. So that maybe we basically need to make some sort of HTTP request in the app itself. And that's where basically the information lies. So essentially, if we ever wanted to get it to the counter right over here, we would have to pass that information down right over here to component 1, and then component 1 would pass that information to component 2, and then that information would be passed to component 3, and then that information would be passed to component 4, and then that information would eventually be passed into the counter, and then the counter can deal with it. Now, again, this is prop drilling, and this is not what we want, really. And that way, and this is kind of the reason why we want to use Vuex, because we can just basically have our state in some sort of centralized store, and essentially, we can basically just get access to it to whatever component that we want. So that we're going to basically be dealing with this over here. This architecture may seem pretty much useless and very bad, but I'm just trying to kind of quickly demonstrate the powers of Vuex. So now that we have basically our kind of app up and running, which is terrific, you can see here that it's getting similar. Let's go ahead and let's just create these parts over here. And we're going to create this in a way where we are going to be using Vuex. So let's go about doing that in the next section. Okay, so let's start tackling our first little piece of this counter component. And essentially, we're going to initially work on this section right over here. So the counter itself and this kind of input section right over here. So let's go ahead and let's do this. So over here, let's add another h1. And we're going to give this a class of counter. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's say class of counter, because we're going to give this a little bit of default classes. So over here, we're going to have a class of counter. And initially, let's just hard code it as, say, 0. Over here in our styles, we're just going to say .counter, and we're just simply going to give this just a size of 5 rem. So this is just going to be a simple font size of 5 rem, just so we can make it nice and big. So right over here, we should have something that looks relatively like this. So let's also go ahead and let's create these input components. So let's go here and let us create our button. So our button is going to essentially, so over here, we're going to have our button. And this first button is just going to contain the plus sign, or actually the minus sign. That's going to be our first button. And then we're also going to have a input. And we're going to give this input right over here. It's not going to have any styles, but it's going to have a type of number. So we can ensure that people don't put any strings in there. So we can do type of number. And let's also copy and paste this button because we also need a plus button. So a plus button right over here. So we can go ahead and now we have something that looks like this. Let's just quickly style it so it looks a little something like this, just a little bit better. This is going to be very, very quick styles. It's not going to be that big of a deal. So let's go over here and we're just going to do a little bit of styling. Typically I would have you copy and paste, but this is very, very easy. So we're just going to do this. So the buttons, we're going to give it a border radius of 100, just so it can be nice and round. We're also going to give it a border of none, just to get rid of that default border. We're going to give it a width of 2 rems and a height of 2 rems as well. We're also going to give it a font weight of 700. And lastly, what we're going to do is we're going to give it a cursor of pointer. Now the input element, we're just going to give it a little bit of styling. So over here, we're just going to give it a quick padding of 0.4 rems all across the board. We're also going to give it a little bit of margin of 0 rems in the x or in the y-axis and 0.5 rems in the x-axis. If you don't know any of this, it's okay. It's fine. Just copy this. This is really pretty much all the styling that we're really going to do. And over here, we basically have something that is relatively similar to what we have over here. Okay, cool. So now let's actually go ahead and let's work with, well, our state. So there's really 2 pieces of state that we have to worry about. This over here, which we hard coded as 0. So this is a piece of state that we have to worry about. And then also another piece of state that we have to worry about is, well, whatever the value is of this input element right over here, because this could constantly change. We can constantly change it to whatever it is, and we actually have to store this somewhere, this piece of information somewhere. So let's actually begin with this over here. So to do this, we're gonna be doing, well, two-way binding. And this is, again, a Vuex course, so I do expect you to know a little bit of Vue. So essentially, what we're going to do is we're going to have a local state. And again, a local state, we're going to do that with data. And this is going to return, a particular value. So a particular value. And initially, we're going to set this value to 1. Now, what we're going to do is basically, inside of that input, we are going to have a V model. And this is going to basically allow us to have that two-way binding. And that V model is basically going to be, well, associated with that value. So essentially, this is basically going to contain the value of, well, this value over here. And anytime that we end up changing it, well, there's going to be two-way binding. So now we can actually go ahead and we can basically change it. And if we went over here and for some reason we wanted to display the value piece of state, we can actually see it change live right over here. So now we know that our piece of state inside of our component basically is changing when we change our inputs. Now let's actually change this back to 0 because this is not really what we want. But this right here is known as, well, local state, because this is a piece of state that is only residing in this component right over here. Now we can also create a counter. So we can also create something like a counter. We can initially set this to 0. And then this over here could also be a counter. And we can go ahead and save that. And similarly, we only see 0 now. But this, again, is also locally stored. Now, with this application, we might want to do this. But let's say this counter is very important. And this piece of state is actually needed for multiple components. Well, we want to somehow store this in that centralized global Vuex store. Now, how do we go about doing that? Well, let's do that right about now. So let's actually change this back to 0. And let's figure out a way where we can actually store this count state essentially somewhere in Vuex. So how do we do this? Well, to do this, the first thing that we have to do is we actually have to install the Vuex library because it doesn't come off the top with Vuex. So to do this, what we would have to do is we would have to do npm install and then vuex at next to get basically the latest version of Vuex, essentially Vuex 4. So once we install that, we should be able to go to our package.json right over here. And in a little bit, once it installed, we should see Vuex version 4. So now we have Vuex installed in our application. So this is great. Now, how do we use it? Well, to use it, we have to go to our main.js. And essentially, we have to use Vuex to create a store. So to do that, we have to essentially use the create store method. Now we get that, well, from Vuex. So over here, you can see here, what we can do is essentially we can go and create a store. Now, once we create the store, we actually have to, well, create it. So we get this method. Now we have to use this create store to actually create a store. So how do we go about doing that? Well, to do it, all we have to do now is essentially all we have to do is basically go ahead and do const store, and then this is going to be equal to, well, create store. And this is going to be, again, a function, and this is going to take in an object. And then in this object, we're going to contain, well, everything that we need inside of this store. Now, still, we haven't really connected the store to our Vue application. So now what we can do is we can do something like this. Well, we can do something like const app is equal to this right over here. So we can say this over here, which is create app. And then we can do something like, well, app.use, and we want to use this particular store. So now essentially the app is using the store that we have created. And then we can go ahead and do app.mount, and we can go ahead and mount this store. So now if we save this, well, nothing has changed, but nothing is broken. So, well, this must be working. So now what is the next step? Well, we want to create that counter state, and we want to put it inside of this global store. Well, to do this, all we have to do is create state. So over here, you can see that it kind of autofills, and state, similarly to data, is going to be a method that returns all of the state that we want to store in this globalized store. So we want to basically store the counter. So initially, that is going to be 0. So if we go ahead and save this, now we can go to our, so now we can basically go to our counter.view and actually access this right over here. And this is pretty magical. We actually don't have to do any sort of connection, anything of that nature. Now, how do we basically access this? Well, what we can do is we can do something like this. So now for each component, because we have connected our Vue application to a store, we have access to $store. And this contains a bunch of objects. Now to access the counter state, we would do $store.state.counter. So we can go ahead and save this. And now if we refresh, you can see here that it is still 0. Now if I were to go ahead and change this to like, I don't know, 10, well, this changes to 10, which is terrific. Now we have access to this, and we actually have access to this to whatever component. So over here, we can basically go in component 2, for instance, and we can do the exact same thing. We can basically access $store, and then we can basically state dot whatever that piece of state is, and now we have access to that over here. You can see that we have a 10 right over here. Now, of course, we don't want to have this, so we can actually get rid of it. But this kind of demonstrates that wherever the component is, we have access to that piece of state because it is in our globalized Vuex store. So this is terrific. Now, there's actually 2 approaches that you can take to actually access pieces of state from the Vuex store. So you can take this approach over here, or you can take an approach where you can essentially map whatever the piece of state is into a computed object. So over here, what we can do instead is we can do something like import, and we can, oh, of course I always do this inside of the export default, which is bad. So we'll do it over here. So essentially we're going to import something from Vuex, and this something is known as map state. And essentially this map state, what it does is it takes all of the state that we specify, and we can basically destructure them in the computed object. So essentially we can destructure the map state, and this is basically a function that takes in an array of all the state that we want. So we can say that we want the counter state. So we can actually go ahead and ask for that right over here. So we can have basically, let's go to our main, and let's say we have multiple counters. So let's say we have something like counter 2 and then counter 3. And this is going to be, let's say 11, and then let's say this is 12. So we can actually go ahead, instead of doing store.state.counter, store.state.counter2, we can basically essentially say here that, hey, I want the first counter, and maybe I also want counter 3. I believe we have counter 3. Yeah, so we want basically these 2. And now what we can do is basically just say counter. So now we can save this. And the reason why we can just say counter is because, well, we destructured counter in our computed object. So now, similarly over here, we have access to it. Now we can also go ahead and do counter 3, and we should have 12, but we don't have access to counter 2 because, well, we didn't ask for counter 2. So as you can see here, it completely fails. We don't have it. Now if you wanted access to counter 2, we can basically use this map state and specify counter 2. So this is a really good way to just specifically ask for exactly what we want. So now we have access to counter 2. Now I just want this one counter, and this is really what we are going to be using. So we can actually get rid of all these, and we can actually just go ahead in our state right over here. So in our state right over here, we're just going to change this to counter. And now we have counter 10. So that right there is how we can essentially globalize state with Vuex. Now the next step is to, well, be able to change this state. And we change the state through mutations. And we're going to see that in the next section. Okay, so now let's talk about how we can start changing our state. For instance, when I click plus plus, this should change, and when I click minus minus, it should change appropriately. Let's actually look at this example. Over here, let's say I have 10. Well, if I go ahead and press plus, you can see that it changes correctly. If I do minus, it also changes correctly. And this right here is, well, changing our state. And changing our state in software development is known as mutating state. So to actually do this in Vuex, we're going to be using something known as a mutation. And we can actually define this inside of our store right over here. So to do that, we can have another object known as, well, mutations. And this is not going to be a method, rather, this is going to be a simple object. And within this object, we are going to contain a bunch of methods that are going to update our state in some way. For instance, let's add basically the method that allows us to add a particular number to this state. So let's call this add to counter. So this is what the method is going to be called. And this is going to basically be a method that essentially takes in two arguments. And so the first argument is going to be, well, the state itself. And this is going to be automatically passed into this method by Vuex. Now, another argument is known as the payload. And this is essentially any value that we want this method to have access to. And this is basically going to correspond to whatever this input value is over here. So let's say, we can basically give it 100 if we want to, or we can give it 5 if we want to, or -5 if we want to. And that is essentially going to be the payload. So the state is basically this right over here, this object over here, and this is going to be automatically passed in by Vuex. And the payload is going to be any value that we want to give our mutation. So let's go ahead and let's actually essentially update this counter. So to update this counter is going to be very, very easy. All we have to do is say state.counter, and essentially we want to change it to something. Well, we want to change it to state.counter plus the payload. And remember, the payload is going to be anything that we pass in. In this example, it's going to be a particular number corresponding to the number that we have over here. So now let's go ahead and let's save this. And now how do we go ahead and use this in our application? Well, we go to our counter, and this is where we're going to use another method known as, well, map mutations. Now we're not going to destructure this in the computed because this is an actual method. And so we're going to destructure this in the methods object. And we're going to do the very same thing. We're going to do map mutations, and we're going to specify, well, what mutations we want. Now over here we have only one mutation, but we could have multiple mutations. So we can go here and we can say, well, I want the add to counter mutation. So now what we can do is we can essentially say, well, at a click, so when I click something, I want to call this add to counter method. So add to counter, and essentially we're going to pass in the payload. Now remember, the payload is going to be this value right over here. So let's go ahead and let's pass that in. Now we can save it. So now if we go to our example right over here, we can actually add numbers in. And then over here we can say, well, if we wanted to change it to 10, well, okay, we actually run into a little bit of an issue. Now this issue is not really a Vuex issue. The issue here is that this number 10 is actually going to be the string 10. So what we're doing is we're actually concatenating the string 10. Now to fix this issue, simply all we have to do is basically parse this value to an integer. So we can just do something like parse int, and we can go ahead and save this, and let's refresh our page. So now you can see here we're starting off with 10. We can add a bunch of numbers. Now if we go ahead and add 10, well, this is adding. So we can actually add whatever it is that we want, which is terrific. However, at the moment, we cannot subtract. So let's actually go ahead and let's create the mutation for subtraction. So now to do this, all we have to do is create another mutation. So we can say subtract from counter. And this is also going to take in a state and a piece of payload that we will provide. Now similarly over here, this is going to basically change the state in some way. So we can say state.counter is equal to state.counter minus the payload. So now again, to get access to this, we can just use the map mutation over here, and we can say that, hey, we also want the subtract from counter. Now over here, we can also do another at click. And then we can say, Well, let's subtract this from the counter, and we're going to pass in the value, and this time we're going to make sure that we parse int it. So we can say parse int of the value. So now if we save this, well, now we can add a value, we can also subtract a value, which is terrific, and this is exactly what we want. We can also subtract the value by a certain amount, which is, again, terrific, because that's exactly what we wanted. So over here, anytime that we want to change a particular state in our globalized store, we would use a mutation. And that right there is essentially what mutations are doing. Okay, so let's actually go about and let's create this button over here. Now this button is a little bit interesting because once we click this button, we are actually making an HTTP request to get a random number between -1000 and 1000. And once we get that number, then we are basically adding that number to the state. So over here you can see if we do a click, over here if we add or we subtract, you can see it is pretty much instant. Whereas over here, it does take a little bit of time to update. And the reason for this is because HTTP requests are asynchronous. They need some time to actually fetch the data, and then over there we have to use that data to update the state. So you can see that there is a little bit of a lag. Now this asynchronicity is actually very important because it kind of changes the way that we are going to perform mutations. And let me explain how. So typically we would add a mutation right over here. So maybe we can have something where we can fetch the data and then basically update the counter with that data. However, mutations should never contain asynchronous code. Mutations should always have synchronous codes. If we ever want to use asynchronous code and update our data with a mutation, instead what we use is something known as an action. So over here, we can actually create actions. And with actions, what we can do is we can have asynchronous code, and we can basically dispatch a mutation or call a mutation once we have performed our asynchronous code. So essentially, an action will allow us to call a specific mutation. Now, an action will also allow us to perform asynchronous code and then call that mutation with that asynchronous code. And that is why we are going to be using actions. So over here, let's use our first action. So we're going to actually mark this as async because, well, it is going to be an asynchronous method because, again, we are fetching some data. Now over here, let's call this random, add random number. And this is going to basically contain the context, and I'll explain what that is in a second. Now over here, what we're going to be doing is we are going to be making some sort of asynchronous request. Now to make asynchronous requests, a library that I like to use is Axios. So let's go ahead and let's install Axios. So let's do that a quick install. This shouldn't take very, very long. And then what we can do is once we install Axios, we can actually import Axios. So we can go ahead and import Axios into this state over here. So import Axios from Axios, and then we can make a asynchronous request. So we can basically say, well, let data equal to await axios.get, and then over here we specify the string or the URL of the API that we are trying to hit. In this case, it is this URL right over here. I'll have this URL in the description below, but essentially it is it's basically an API that allows us to hit a random number between a min and a max. Over here, I set it as -1000 and 1000. So if I were to go ahead and just paste this URL right in here, you can see here, let's actually zoom in. I get a random number right over here between these two ranges. So you can see that's what we're doing. So let's go ahead, and now we are making that request. Now, once we make this request, we actually want to call a specific mutation, especially while we want to call this add mutation. And the reason why we want to call the add mutation is because, well, we could have either a positive or a negative number, and that kind of allows us to add and subtract numbers. So we want to basically add whatever the data that comes back over here into this mutation. So how do we do this? Well, this is where we are going to use the context. So the context is basically going to contain everything that is typically inside of our store. So it's going to contain the state, it's going to contain all the mutations, and it's going to contain this special method known as commit. And this will allow us to call a specific mutation. Now, specifically, we want to call the add to counter mutation. And this should be a string. So let's go ahead. So we want to basically call this add to counter mutation, and then we want to provide it with a specific payload. Now the payload is the data. Now specifically it is going to be the data.data. Now let me kind of show you why with a quick console.log. And basically this is just going to be the number that, well, we have over here. And I'm just going to show you a console.log just to kind of tell you why it's data.data. But right there, what we're doing is we're performing asynchronous requests to get a number, and then we are calling a mutation with that asynchronous data. And we can only really perform that with actions. Now, theoretically, we can perform this with a mutation, but it is a very, very bad practice. So over here, we have our action. Now, in this example, I'm using it because of asynchronicity, but well, we don't really need to have an asynchronous piece of code to do this. We also could potentially just say, hey, we have this method over here, which is synchronous, and essentially I want to commit a specific mutation at the counter with this payload. So this right here is actually synchronous code, so we could potentially do it in our mutations, but we also could do it with actions. So it's kind of a two-step layer, and this is actually the kind of the best approach of taking it. But in this example, we're just going to be using it for asynchronicity. So let's go ahead and we're just going to save this, and then we are going to move into our counter component so we can actually go ahead and use it. So let us move in there. So now that we are in our counter component, let's actually create the button. So I'm going to create this button inside of a div so it doesn't stay in the same row. So inside of a div, and this button is going to be a button. We're going to give the text of add by random number. There we go. So if we save this and we go back to our app, you can see here, very ugly. So let's actually fix this up with a little bit of styling. Let's just give this a quick class of btn. And then we're going to go over here and we're just going to say .btn. We're going to give it a little bit of styling. So let's see what these styles are going to be. So we're going to essentially eliminate the border radius. We don't want it to be a circle. We'll just say, hey, be 0.5 rems. We're going to give it a width of auto so it can fill up the whole thing and not be confined to, I believe it was 2 rems. Then we're going to give it a background color, or not background, clip, a background color of hashtag 41B983. Could be any color, but I like this nice green color. This is the Vue color actually. And then we're going to give it a margin top of 1 rem. We're also going to give it a color of white so that text can be white. And lastly, we're going to give it a cursor of pointer. So at that point, we have this right over here. So now what we want to do is when we call this, we want to call that specific action. So how do we do this? Well, as always, we're going to use the map actions method over here so we can map our actions. Now we're going to map our actions inside of the methods because they're, well, methods that we eventually call. So we're going to say map actions, and we want to map the add random number action. So now what we can do is once we click this button right over here, so once we go ahead and click this button, we want to call the add random number action, which will eventually call the the add to counter mutation once it basically fetches the data. So let's go ahead and let's refresh this real quick, and let's give this a shot. And there we go. It works completely. Now let's quickly just go ahead and let's console.log. Let's just look at the console.log. You can see here that we get an object. So this is an object. This is the whole data. And then over here we have another kind of data field right over here of data. And that's why we're saying data.data. And that basically passes in this as the payload. But right here, this works perfectly fine. This is terrific. This is great. We're pretty much done this part of our application. The next part is to, well, worry about this over here. So again, this part is where we are essentially displaying the history of our app. And essentially, if we want to search for a specific number, so let's say 857, we actually see it bolded right over here. Or maybe if you want to see 523 or 252, we're going to see it bolded over here. And this is actually very, very interesting, and we can actually accomplish this relatively easily with Vuex with getters, and we're going to get to that in the next section. Okay, so in this section, we are going to create that history component right over here that we are missing. Now, as you can imagine, this is going to be a completely separate component. So let's go ahead and let's create it. So over here, let's go to our components directory and let's create a new file, and we're going to call this history.vue. Now we can actually let's actually go ahead and let's just basically copy and paste a Vue template. And then what we can actually do is we can basically kind of use this component wherever we really want. So let's go ahead and let's get rid of these components over here. And let's actually basically render this component in the component3.vue file. And we're just going to put it right under the component 4. So we're going to put it right over here. And so to do that, what we would have to do is we would have to import the history component from, well, history. And then over here, we have to also specify that the history component is a history. So, the history component is a component right over here. So now we can basically save this. And let's go over here and let's essentially add a h4, which is basically going to be the title of history. So this is going to be our title. And we're just going to call this history. So now if we save this, this completely fails, and the reason for this is it says history component is registered, but it's not used, and that's because I misspelled history in this component right over here. So we can go ahead and spell this correctly in both cases. So we can save this, and now over here we see our history component. So let us do a little bit of restyling just to make everything look a little bit nicer. So let's go ahead over here to our history component, and essentially the first thing I want to do is just basically give this a class of, say, container. So we're going to give this a class of container, and basically this container is simply just going to contain a margin top. So container, and this is going to have a margin. Oh, oops, what am I doing here? So this is going to contain a margin top of 7 rems. So if we go ahead and save this, we can see that now there's a little bit of spacing. So now the next step is to basically showcase the history of every single counter value that ever existed. Now this over here can actually be located in the state itself, and this could basically be an array. So essentially over here we can have basically a history piece of state in our Vuex, and this can be an array. Now inside of the array we can initially start off with 0 because, well, we always start off with 0 in a fresh component. Or I guess in this case it is 10, but let's change this back to 0 over here. So over here we can basically say that we always start off with 0. So now what we can do is we can basically take this state inside of our history component and essentially map through it and render all of those values. Now, how do we do that? Well, we explored how we did that multiple times. So we can do that with, well, the map state method from Vuex. And essentially over here, now what we can do is we can have a computed object and we can basically destructure all of the state that we want. Now in this case, we have two pieces of state in our Vuex, but we only want the history. We don't really care about the counter. So now what we can just say is, hey, I just want the history. Now in this case, we can basically loop through that array, and for each array we can render a p tag that displays that specific counter value. So let's actually go about doing that. Let's first wrap it in a div, and let's give this div a class of flex. So we're going to give this div a class of flex, and this div is going to contain just a little bit of classes itself. So we're going to say, well, because it's flex, we're going to say display flex. We're also going to give it a text align of center. We're also going to give it a width of 25 rems. We're also going to give it a margin of 0 auto, just so we can center it right in the middle. We can also do a justified content of center, and also we'll do a flex wrap of wrap. Again, if you don't know this, it's okay. It's just a little bit of styling. But in here, what we're going to do is we're going to have a p tag. And essentially this p tag, we're going to have a v4 in it, because essentially this is where we are going to render our, we're going to iterate through our history state and basically render each number with a p tag. So over here, what we can have is a v4. So this is just typical Vue. So we can say something like, okay, well, we want the number and the index. So let's say the number and the index. And we want that from the history state, or the history state inside of our Vuex. And let's say also the key can be index over here, so we can get rid of that error. And that is pretty much it. Now over here, what we can do now is basically we can render that number. So over here, what we have now is just a simple 0. Now, if we went ahead and we changed this to 4, nothing is happening. And the reason is because we're not mutating our state yet. So let's go ahead and let's mutate our state. So to do that, very, very simple. Essentially, when we mutate our state, either by adding or subtracting, what we want to do is we want to get that number, that new counter, and we want to push it into this history array. So this is very easy. All we have to do is state.history.push, and we basically push state.counter. And we want to do this for every single one right over here. So we can go ahead and save that. And we can save that, and now we can go over here. Now we can add it, and you can see that it has changed. All right, awesome. So let's go ahead and let's do something like this. Okay, terrific. Now the spacing is a little bit off, so let's go ahead and quickly fix that. So let's go ahead over here, and let's do a little bit of a little bit more styling, just to kind of fix the spacing. So let's say the p tag inside of the div with a class of flex, we're going to give it a margin of 1 rem. So let's go ahead. Now we have basically a little bit more spacing, which is definitely more ideal. So now we can go ahead and we can continuously add numbers, and you can see here that it is basically appending all of our numbers right over here, which is terrific. Now, let's say, again, what we wanted in our kind of final version is an input right over here where we can input a specific number, and we can see all of the instances bolded of that number. So let's actually go about creating that input, and then we'll figure out how we can create the logic using getters to do this. So let's go ahead and let's create this input. So this input is going to live right below the, so it's going to live right below the div. And essentially over here, we're going to have a placeholder of search by index. We're also going to have a type of number to ensure that only numbers are available. and we're also going to have a v model of, well, value. And that means also over here we need to create our state inside of the data method, and we're going to have to return essentially a value, and initially we'll have this as 0. So let's do a comma, and this is basically going to allow us to have that two-way binding that we always wanted. So now right now we can see here that we have that. Now, how do we go about, essentially, how do we go about, when I click on, let's say I want 33. So when I do 33, how do I go about essentially changing this over here? Well, what we could do is on a specific change, we can call something known as a getter. And the getter is going to contain a bunch of different logic, and then is going to give us whatever it is that we want. So let's kind of explain that in a kind of a real life example. So essentially what we can do over here is we can define something known as a getter. So let's go ahead and let's define a getter, and this is also going to be an object. So it's called getters because we can have multiple getters in here. And essentially what getters is a way that we can actually see our data in some sort of manipulated fashion. So when we basically call for a state, we only get basically that specific number. But what if we wanted to basically get the state and essentially kind of manipulate it in some way so we can see it in a different way? Well, to do that, we would use getters. Now, specifically in this case, what we really want is basically the indexes of the numbers, of all the numbers that are equal to this particular value over here. And the reason for this, let's actually go to the production version, and let's basically say that we want, we basically pass in 3. Well, if we pass in 3, then we want the index of basically 0, 1, 2, and then 3 over here. And the reason for this is because if we get this index, what we can basically do is we can say, hey, once we're iterating through this particular array, if the index is basically this, if the index that we get is equal to the index of this particular value, we can actually go ahead and bold it. And we can actually do that with a getter. So let's do that right about now. So essentially we can basically define a method known as active indexes, for instance. So these are basically all the indexes of the value that we basically passed in. Now over here, this is going to be a method that takes in the state. Now we also need to be able to pass in the payload. Now the payload over here is very, very easy. We can just basically pass it in as a second argument. But with getters, we actually have to basically call another function, essentially to get our payload. So we're basically over here, we have a function that returns another function, and this first function contains our state, and then the second function is going to contain our payload, and essentially then this function is going to return the data that we want to ultimately see. So over here, let's do indexes. So this is going to be an array because we can have multiple indexes. For instance, if I did something like 8, 5, 7, you can see here we can get this index right over here, and we can get this index over here. So we can have multiple indexes. And essentially now what we're going to do is we're going to iterate through that history state, and basically for each element what we are going to do is we're going to say we want basically to iterate through the numbers, and we want to get basically that number and that number's index. And then essentially what we want to do is we want to say, okay, if the number that we're currently iterating over is equal to the payload, what we want to do is essentially we want to push the index of that number into this indexes array. So we can do indexes.push of index. And then what we can do here is simply return. So we can go ahead and simply return all of the indexes. Now over here you can see again, this is a getter that gives us kind of different data based on different logic, but is dependent on the data inside of our state. So now what we can do here is we can basically go to the history, and to access that specific getter, we can essentially use, well, map getters. Now over here, what we can simply do now is, because the getters is just a piece of data and it's not a method or anything of that nature, we can just simply put it, the structure inside of our computed. So we can say getters, and what getter do I want? Well, I want the active indexes getter. So let's go ahead and let's save that. And now this, what it is going to simply get us is an array of the active indexes. So if I were to, let's actually just go ahead and let's do active indexes, and let's just go ahead and save this right over here. So you can see that, oops, we actually have to call it with a particular index. So let's actually call it with a value. So it's important that we call it. And you can see here that it is basically all of the, so over here, this is basically a value of 0. And because our history only contains basically one object with 0, you can see here that, hey, the active index is 0. Now, if I were to, let's say, add 1 and then subtract 2, you can see here that we have a 0 here, and we also have a 0 here. So basically, essentially, these are the indexes that we want to bold. So how do we do that? Well, this is just a little bit of logic that we can do over here. So essentially what we can do now is basically for each iteration, we can basically say, hey, is the index of this particular number inside of this array? If it is inside of this array, we want to bold it. If it's not, then, well, we don't want to bold it. So this first number, we can basically say, well, this first number has an index of 0. The 0 is inside of this array, so we are going to bold it. This number has an index of 1. 1 is not inside of this array, so we're not going to bold it. This number over here has an index of 2, and this is inside of our array, so we are going to bold it. And we can actually do this with the includes method in JavaScript. So let's actually go about doing that right now. So essentially over here, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to create a class known as bold. So we're going to create a class known as bold. And this is just simply going to increase the font weight to, let's say, 900. So we're going to increase the font weight to 900. And basically over here, when we are actually looping through the history, what we can do is we can generate a dynamic class. So we can say, okay, well, if the active index of the particular value that we pass in, now remember this value is going to be a string, so we have to actually parse int it. So again, if the active index of the value that we pass in, and remember this is going to give us this array, well it was there, but it's going to give us that array. So this right here, this whole thing is going to give us the array. And then we're going to say if, this array includes this particular index that we're iterating over, then what we want to do is we want to give it the bold class. So again, what this right here is doing is it's going to give us an array of all the indices basically that correspond to all the indices that correspond to a particular value inside of our history array. So this is what that is doing. And then over here, we're basically saying if the index that we are currently, or if the index of the number that we're currently iterating over, if that's included in this array, then we want to give this p element the class of bold. So now we can go ahead and we can actually save this. And now you can see here that it is bolded. So we can actually go ahead, let's add by a random number. Let's add by like, just subtract over here. Let's just do a bunch of like kind of iterations. Let's just do a bunch of things. And now let's say if I did something like 72, you can see here we get all the instances of 72. And that right there is our complete application. I hope you guys learned a lot about Vuex. We covered pretty much everything that you really need to know. Maybe the next steps that you might want to take is look into modules, which allow us to kind of separate our concerns, but that is very easy. I don't want to kind of dwell on it all too much, but it's just basically good for organization. But that is pretty much it. We've covered a lot of what Vuex is tackling. Essentially, we've covered everything over here except for modules. Again, modules is just a way that we can actually go ahead and kind of separate our concerns, because if we have a very large application, what we might want to do is we want to basically have our state in multiple modules. So you can see here we can have our state in this module, and then we can have our state in this module. Maybe this is basically for the counter, and maybe this is for something else like authentication. And we can actually keep them in separate modules, but then what we can do is we can actually put them right over here into basically that same store. So essentially we have another method inside of our store known as modules. And basically what we can do is we can extract all of our getters, all of our state, all of our actions that correspond to a specific kind of feature. So again, what we could do is we can basically get all this and put it into a counter module. And maybe if we had some sort of authentication data, we could put that in another module, and then we can just put the modules together. So that's the only thing that we haven't manually done, but this is something that you can probably read very easily and kind of do it yourself. So we really covered basically everything that you really need to know. We talked about state, we talked about getters, we talked about mutations, and we talked about actions, and we talked a little bit about modules. So I hope this is a good introduction, and I hope this crash course was worthwhile, because now you are pretty much a very, very comfortable with Vuex. So I'll see you guys in the next crash course.